Welcome to the Worst Sports Channel on YouTube, Hot Garbage Sports with me, Coach Ryan D. Habs fans, we're back. We're going to keep talking about trades for the Habitants, the Montreal Canadiens, because they're looking like the team that has a couple pieces that people around the NHL would be liking. And let's face it, Montreal fans, it's full rebuild time. New GM, season didn't go the way you wanted it. It's tank for right time, and it's draft pick time. So you got to go ahead, put some bullets in the gun. We got to get some draft picks here for the Montreal Canadiens and start that rebuild. So let's go over 5 likely trade candidates for the Montreal Canadiens. Starting at number 1 is the number 1 trade candidate on TSN's trade bait board. Creative on this channel, I know. It's Ben Chiarot. Ben Chiarot is definitely the most likely trade candidate heading out of Montreal for several reasons. Number 1, he has 0 years left after this year, so he is a pure rental player wherever he's going. And at the trade deadline, the reason it's usually so quiet in the NHL, I mean, we have whole panels dedicated to trade deadlines, but the reason the trade deadline has way less of a punch over the last many years is because teams just don't want to take on the massive amount of salary caps and the lengthy amount of times on a question mark, so they leave that to the offseason. So at the trade deadline, we're looking for those players with 1 or 0 years left after this year, and we're looking for those players who are moving into the UFA category. RFA is awesome for the teams acquiring them, but UFA is usually what ends up getting dealt. So Ben Chiarot is a UFA after this year. He has a $3.5 million salary cap hit, which is extremely reasonable, leaving him open for a lot of teams to take. And the number 1 reason teams want to take him is defenseman is who moves at the deadline. Teams love to bolster down the middle, and they love to bolster defensemen. Goalies, I know they seem like the most important thing in hockey, and they are, but they're the hardest to trade for because they're just so volatile. It's why they're drafted so late in drafts. So Ben Chiarot being a defenseman, he's a left shot defenseman with 0 years left. He's a UFA and a low contract hit, as well as the fact that he's really good. He's a meat and potatoes kind of guy that beats up guys in front of the net. He's got a booming shot. He can add points when required. Ben Chiarot is likely to be moved from the Montreal Canadiens. What could you get back for him? I think it is no less than a second-round pick, but it should be a first. I fully think you should be able to get a first for such a low salary cap hit for someone pushing for the cup. And Habs fans, if you're new to this channel and Hot Garbage Sports, we have a lot of you on here. We covered your playoff run last year, a lot of fantastic Habs videos in the link above with the cards, as well as the link down below. So subscribe, join us on here, Habs fans. We'll cover your rebuild over the next couple years. It's not a big deal. Every team rebuilds at some point. That's how you end up with dynasties. All right, the next 4 we're going to talk about are possibilities, but not locks in my eyes. So in order, I think the number 2 trade candidate from Montreal is actually Brett Kulak, and it's for the same reason as Ben Chiarot. Kulak's a defenseman. He's a left-handed shot. Kulak is 27 years old. He has a small cap hit of $1.85 million. It's not going to fetch a huge price on the open market, but the thing with Kulak is, although, sorry, Habs fans, I don't think he's that good, so I don't think a lot of contending teams are going to be like, yes, we need this guy, but he's a depth piece. You could bring him in as a number 7, number 8 guy that sits on your bench in case of injury, and that is super vital when it comes to the playoffs for teams like the Tampa Bay Lightning, the Edmonton Oilers, maybe the Toronto Maple Leafs. There's a whole bunch of teams out there that this guy could actually fit into their roster and under their salary cap with the low cost of acquisition. Montreal can hang on to a little bit of salary if required for a contending team. He ends up filling a depth piece. It's not that expensive, but he gets you a bullet in the gun. If you don't trade him, though, you end up with nothing, so I do suspect that Kulak will be moved. Okay, the number 3 most likely traded candidate, and it's getting less likely the further we go down the list, is Jonathan Drouin. Drouin's a good player. He's got 14 points in the last 25 games. Drouin can add some punch into a top 6 for a lot of teams. The problem with Drouin is the $5.5 million cap hit. The second problem with Drouin is that he's a winger. He's just a winger. And I hate to use the term just a winger, but they're just not as coveted as defensemen are at the trade deadline. You always can use defensive depth, especially NHL proven defensemen, but wingers, you saw it with Cole Caulfield last year. A lot of teams can pull up their guys from the AHL or their young superstars, plug them into a top 6, and many times it ends up working, especially in the short term. So wingers are just an easier commodity to replace, and wingers have the easiest transition into the NHL, especially for scoring punch. So Drouin comes in with a very high cost, limiting targeting the places that he could actually go. And the other problem with Drouin is that he has 1 year left after this year, so he's got to fit within the salary cap of that team the next year. The good news with Drouin, though, is it's only 1 year left after this year. So some teams actually do covet the fact that they're not just getting a rental player, but they got 1 extra year to try to sign the guy. And he's still relatively young. So that's the interesting thing about Drouin. So I have him as number 3 on this list. The side note with Drouin, though, is that at age 26, if Montreal is looking to keep him, he's young enough that you could probably end up re-signing him if he wants to play there and survive a rebuild. So that's the reason number 3 down is likely, but probably not going to happen at the trade deadline. All right, number 4 is Jeff Petry. Jeff Petry could be moved, but I do think that it is unlikely to happen at the trade deadline. I think Petry, if he gets moved, will get moved in the offseason because teams will be looking for that number 1, 2, 3, or 4, depending on the team. I'm not saying Petry's a 3 or 4 defenseman, but I'm saying there are some teams out there that are good enough that if he signs with them, he actually ends up playing in the second pairing. Jeff Petry is a likely candidate to move in the offseason, not at the trade deadline. But hey, you never know. And that's because he's a defenseman and he's an offensive defenseman. He had a career year last year with Montreal, 42 points in 55 games. But the problem this year, he's only got 2 points. So 25 games in this year, Petry's got 2 points. It has been rough sledding for Jeff Petry. He's a very expensive acquisition. He's an older acquisition at age 34, and he's got way too much term left. 3 years to be specific. After this year, that's a lot of risk for a team to take on at the trade deadline. If they're pushing for a cup, they're really saddling themselves with a bit of an albatross of an age, of a contract, and of a guy who all of a sudden you're buying high, who's producing low. So I don't suspect Petry is going to move, but he is a trade candidate at the deadline for Montreal if they can pull off a miracle. What would Petry fetch back? Ooh, the trade deadline, I'm not so sure. In the offseason, maybe a second or a third. He's likely closer to what the Jets got with Nate Schmidt. It was a similar contract to Jeff Petry, who had a down year with Vancouver and fetched a third in the offseason. I see the same thing happening for Jeff Petry likely. And then finally, number 5 is Carey Price. He could move at the deadline. And the reason is there's a lot of teams out there going, hey, there's cup contenders that want to win, but they have a goaltending problem. That's why Anton Khudobin is so high on the TSN trade bait board from Dallas. But we just talked about it. Bringing in a goalie is a big question mark, but bringing in Carey Price is less of a question mark in terms of his performance, more of a question mark in terms of his health. So there are teams out there that could acquire Carey Price. Go ahead, take a look at my video above if you want to know a little more about who could acquire Carey Price. But I think it is actually more likely that Carey Price ends up staying in Montreal due to the contract. It's not like goalies expire or go bad, and Montreal is going to have a ton of cap space over the next 3 to 4 years. They're looking to acquire draft picks, and I don't think you're going to acquire much for Carey Price because that contract is so high. If you end up moving Carey Price out of Montreal, it's really a cap move, and it's not really a draft pick move. I, as an NHL general manager, probably you as well too, why would you take on that cap hit and give away first or second round picks or young prospects to bring in a guy at $10.5 million over the next 4 years who's gone through the injuries and the wear and tear that Carey Price has? There's a lot of questions. There's a lot of risk with bringing him in. So if you're going to end up taking on Carey Price to make a cup run, I suspect Montreal is going to have to retain a lot of that salary. I suspect Montreal is going to have to sweeten the deal, and I don't suspect Montreal is going to get a lot in return. So I actually think it is most likely that Carey Price ends up staying in Montreal through the rebuild and maybe even retiring in Montreal. But we're going to watch it the whole way because it's exciting no matter what when we're talking about Carey Price. Okay, and an honorable mention goes to Brendan Gallagher. Is Gally going to move at the trade deadline? Absolutely not. Again, winger, huge amount of term left. The guy is signed till 2027. He's over $6 million. Sure, he would fit into the top 6 for a lot of teams, but we said it. He's just a winger. He's a good agitator. He's not a young man at this point anymore. This is a guy that if he's going to move in the off season. He's not going to fetch a massive return because of the contract and everything out there. You might get a second round pick for him, but Brendan Gallagher is someone that is likely to move on from Montreal. I don't believe he'll be there through the entire rebuild, but he could be. So he's number 6. He's an honorable mention. I don't think there's any point in worrying about Gallagher before the trade deadline. I don't think he's going to move. It's just too hard to move a guy like that before that period of time. And then because we're looking at the entire Montreal Canadiens roster, there are some untouchables here too. I don't think Christian Dvorak's going anywhere. He's newly signed. He's a centerman. I don't think Joel Armia is going anywhere. Again, he's got term left and he's been a nice addition to Montreal. He's cheap. He's easy to hang on to. He's a good producer. I don't think Mike Hoffman is going anywhere. Again, albatross of a contract. He's a winger, maybe in the offseason, but I just don't see them moving on from Hoffman in the near future. And then the last two are Turdy Lehkonen and Jake Evans. I don't see either of those guys moving either. So the first 6 guys I mentioned have a possibility. Habs fans, let me know what you think down below in the comments. Let me know what you think about the rebuild. Are you excited about the future and the possibility of Montreal in the next 2 or 3 years? I want to know about it.